Okay, hello, and welcome to the inaugural Psychopharmacology Behind the Paper series of tweets from the Psychopharm EBPS account on Neuro Twitter. I'm Stephen Mahler, an associate professor in the Department of Neurobiology and Behavior at the University of California, Irvine, and social media editor for the journal Psychopharmacology, the official journal of the European Behavioral Pharmacology Society. On this hashtag Psychopharm Friday, I am excited to welcome Dr. Kent Berridge, James Olds Professor of Biopsychology at the University of Michigan. Welcome, Dr. Berridge.
Hi, Steve. Great to be Zooming with you today.
Great. So today I'll ask Dr. Berridge to recount the story behind a classic review of his published in Psychopharmacology in 2007, entitled The Debate Over Dopamine's Role in Reward, the Case for Incentive Salience. This is the third most cited paper in the history of our journal, with over 1,500 citations. It belongs to a special issue on the functions of dopamine and represents many of the prevailing views at the time of dopamine functions and behavior from key researchers in the field, including Dr. Berridge. Dr. Berridge, can you describe the circumstances that led to you writing this highly influential review?
Well, in a way, dopamine ideas were sort of swirling in the mid-2000s. There was the traditional idea championed by Roy Wise that dopamine was pleasure liking, the neural common currency for all rewards, and specifically for the pleasure of rewards, the hedonia hypothesis of Roy Wise. There's also the exciting, at that time, still fairly new work by Wolfram Schultz, especially looking at dopamine roles in reward learning, showing that the dopamine neurons would learn to respond to cues for reward and move forward in time to respond only to the cues that predict reward, no longer fire to the reward itself, giving rise to the notion that dopamine was actually forming the memory, the learned memory of reward value in an incremental temporal difference style. And then there was also the notion that had been around since about 1990 from Terry Robinson and me primarily, that dopamine might be involved in wanting rewards, especially in cue-triggered wants for rewards, but not actually mediating the pleasure liking or be necessary for learning about rewards. All three of these literatures were large. The dopamine pleasure liking literature was especially large, massive, and still in the early 2000s, you could see prominent reward neuroscientists and addiction neuroscientists write about dopamine as though it were pleasure liking, the pleasure of the reward. But the literatures didn't connect with each other. They were sort of pursued independently by the people within them. And around 2005, in the summer of 2005, there was a Gordon Summer Conference on dopamine, catecholamines, and a debate was staged. They invited for the debate Roy Wise, he came. John Salamone came from the University of Connecticut, and I was there. Wolfram Schultz, I think, was invited to debate in that summer debate, but he didn't come from England. He was in England at that time. He had moved there already. We had a debate, and it was sort of revved up, I think, the notion that these ideas should be pitted against each other. And it was a very fun debate. It was fun. That following year, the academic year, I went on sabbatical to England, to Cambridge, hosted very generously by Barry Everett, who was master then of a college, and stayed there and visited the psychology department and had many, many conversations that academic year with Wolfram Schultz, Barry Everett, Trevor Robbins, and others in the Cambridge neuroscience group who thought that dopamine really was learning about rewards, either prediction error for Wolfram Schultz or learned habits, the part of the addiction habit theory by Barry Everett and Trevor Robbins that they were championing. So we had many conversations and a fairly argumentative final seminar in the spring of 2006, where we really, all of us, pitted these ideas against each other, and it was a lot of fun. It left me feeling that the case was strong, that dopamine should be thought of as incentive salience, and that there wasn't really a fatal error exposed in these debates. And I thought that the ideas were all plausible and appealing, but they were not equally true. So the stage was set to frame the debate and make the case for dopamine as incentive salience. That's what the paper was.
Great. That's fantastic. And can you, in the 14 or so years since you published that paper, have your views on the functions of dopamine changed? And if so, how?
Well, Views have evolved, and I think the various theories have evolved. One doesn't see claims that dopamine is pleasure liking much anymore. One does see it in textbooks and in neuroscience in general, but I think reward neuroscientists and addiction neuroscientists who specialize in it rarely make the claim explicitly. Although, even today, you can sometimes find sentences within their works which only make sense in that light. I think that people kind of revert to it momentarily, but they are not willing to defend it explicitly anymore. And I don't think it's true that dopamine is pleasure liking. I think it's not that. The reward learning hypothesis has morphed over the years. In 2005, it meant something precise. For prediction error, it meant that it was the temporal difference model-free equation of reward learning that came from artificial intelligence, from computer science. That was very, very clear that dopamine was learning just quantities, essentially, of pure reward goodness, model-free, without any base, without any representation of the identity of that reward. It no longer means that. I think one doesn't see claims for model-free prediction error very often any longer. I think most people who study it now think that dopamine is model-based, that it does have access to representations of the identity of rewards. So the hypothesis is morphed. The term remains. You hear it a lot. Dopamine is prediction learning, prediction error learning in reward. But what it means is no longer as precise and clear. It's sort of morphed into a model-based notion that is not often as defined as clearly. I still think that the data fits beautifully the notion that dopamine primarily is learned value for rewards, the wanting motivational value for rewards when it follows these model-based ways. I don't think there's really any evidence that dopamine is required for any particular kind of learning, for any particular kind of reward memory to be formed. So I don't think it's reward learning still. So my basic notion is I still do think that dopamine is wanting an incentive salience, but the field changes every day, and as you know, complications emerge.
Great. Okay, well, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Berridge, and I really appreciate it, and look forward to seeing you in person sometime soon, I hope.